Hello, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my show where we talk about storytelling in all its forms. Today's guest is Francis Young. He is a UK-based historian and folklorist specializing in the history of religion and belief. Dr. Young is the author, editor, and co-author of over 20 books and well known as an authority on the history of early modern English Catholicism, monastic history, the history of exorcism, the history of magic, the cult of St Edmund, British fairy lore, and pre-Christian Baltic religion, which is especially interesting for me, and we'll talk about it a bit later. So he is also a professional indexer of academic books and a translator specializing in medieval and early modern Latin. And that was a lot to read. That's very impressive. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Dr. Young.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Gabriela.
So I think maybe because we're going to be focusing on, you have so many specialisms, but we're going to be focusing on a kind of folklore in the topic of the podcast being storytelling. We're going to be talking about the ways in which storytelling informs your work in many ways. So shall we start with, maybe you could define for us what folklore is? Because I'm not sure everybody has a very clear idea of what it actually is.
Yeah, I think our ideas of folklore have changed a bit over the years. The term was devised in 1845, and it really, originally it meant traditional stories. It could be customs, could be songs, could be dance, could be anything which belongs to oral folk culture. But I think that the way it's changed really is that that used to be very much focused on the past. It used to be that we thought of folklore as something which is, stuff that people believed or people practiced in the dim and distant future, or at least in, in grandmother and grandfather's time. Whereas I think now there's more of a recognition that things like urban legends, things like digital memes and things could also be classed as folklore, because they are kind of non-official, popular folk culture. In other words, they're organically generated from mass culture, but they're not things that are planted there by branding agencies or marketing campaigns or by scholars. So they spontaneously and organically arise from folk culture.
I mean, it's really interesting for me when you talk about, being planted by scholars. And the reason I'm latching onto that is because, of course, you say that the term came out as sort of 1945, you said.
1845.
1845.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Because there was like a lot of interest, obviously, in like late 19th century in reviving old folk traditions and kind of creating like a nation-based sense of identity around those traditions. And in many countries, like in Eastern Europe, for example, that had a very political aspect to it. And obviously the way the scholars approached it has changed since then. Can you sort of talk a little bit about the approach then and how it is approached now?
Yes, and I think this is this is something which is less appreciated perhaps by those who specialize in English folklore, because if you only ever look at English folklore, or even to some extent Irish folklore or British folklore, then you won't appreciate the extent to which it becomes involved in regional and local nationalisms, because I think it never really had the same function in England, certainly. Whereas if you're looking at those people groups in Central and Eastern Europe who are at the end of the 19th century or the second half of the 19th century, trying to establish an identity, which is not an identity that's necessarily based on previous political alignments, although those previously existing political alignments, looking back into the distant past, they also are important. But it's for the first time based on a kind of linguistic nationalism. So the idea that a people is defined by the language that it speaks. And this is something which is new. If you go back to the old world of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, language was not an important factor in what gave those polities, those states, any kind of unifying identity or being. Whereas when you've got these movements of liberation from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from the Russian Empire, there is this feeling that it needs to be accompanied by self-determination for nations. And therefore the question arises, how do you define the nation? And the most popular answer to that question is that you define the nation via language. And that really kind of explains many of the lines on the map that we see today in Eastern and Central Europe. And so folklore becomes absolutely central to that, because many of these languages do not have much of a literature, if a literature at all, predating the 19th century. And so the only substitute that there is for a prestigious written literature, as it's perceived at the time, is folk culture. And so it's within folklore that the kind of the pioneering kind of nation builders of this era look for the building blocks that they need to construct new nations. Now, of course, that's not universally true. There are many of these nations that actually do have very rich vernacular literatures in their own language, like Poland, for example, or Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, as it later become. You do have much more of a literature there. But there are other nations like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which don't have a vernacular literature, or barely a vernacular literature, existing by the late 19th century.
Yes, I think there's, especially me being Polish, so before Poland was partitioned, of course, and Poland had, we call it Commonwealth, but we were essentially colonizers of Ukraine and Belarus regions and Lithuania, really, from the point of view of people of those regions. So there's sometimes a bit of tension about Polish writers who lived and produced work in Polish, but lived in Lithuania, like Mickiewicz, for example, was probably the most famous Polish poet at the time, and he, in his most famous work, he wrote like Lithuania, my home country, but it was a part of Poland. And for Lithuanians, they see it as an example of their cultural kind of influence, isn't it? There's always a tension.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that the complexities and the nuances and the subtleties of national identity in this region are very difficult to grasp without quite close acquaintance with the cultures. And I think particularly for British people, it can be quite difficult to grasp, because British national identity by comparison is pretty clear cut. And I mean, yeah, I'm not convinced personally, and I speak here as an outsider because I'm neither Polish nor Lithuanian, that the colonization paradigm isn't perhaps the right one to apply. Perhaps we could speak of a certain kind of cultural colonization or linguistic colonization, because there is a degree of polonization.
Polonization, the way Poland was later Russified and then Germanized, as in like Polish culture was being gradually kind of erased. But it's interesting, because obviously it's not entirely so that, like, the whole, like in Great Britain, you have those sort of, I don't know, you have the Welsh sort of nationalistic kind of effort, and the Scottish nationalistic effort, and obviously Ireland, where this sort of very strong attachment to folklore plays a very important part, doesn't it? So how do you view that tension in when you were sort of studying it, and how it was approached in the past, perhaps, and how has it changed?
I think that when it comes to the Baltic and to the Balts, so that would be today the Lithuanians and the Latvians, who are the only remaining Baltic peoples, I think that the challenge is separating out what we can really know about mythology, the original mythology, if we can call it that, of the Baltic peoples, and the way in which this is presented in later elaborations, perhaps we could say, in the 19th century. So you've got figures like, you've got Theodor Narbut in Lithuania, He's actually somebody who's working in Lithuania Minor, which is the part of Lithuania, the Lithuanian-speaking part of Prussia. So he's a German-speaking scholar, but also was interested in Lithuanian folklore. And Theodor Narbut had ideas which we would not accept today. So, for example, he believed that the spirit of a people is expressed in its folklore. So it's the idea of a total kind of reification of the national spirit of a people, like it's a living being, an actual real being, which means that if an author taps into that living spirit of a people, that author is entitled to create new stories inspired by that spirit. So it's almost like a supernatural process. And so he created some of the best known Lithuanian myths. You know, the myth of Jūratė and Kęstutis, which is the story of the fisherman Kęstutis, who goes down to the amber palace of the sea maiden Jūratė, completely made up by Theodor Narbut. But he would not have said that this was a falsification, and he was completely open about what he did. He regarded this as a perfectly legitimate approach. And then in Latvia, you've got Andrejs Pumpurs. I'm sorry if I pronounce any of the Latvian names wrong. That's because I don't actually know any Latvian, so I have to apologize for that. But he wrote a book called Lāčplēsis, which is about a Latvian hero. Now, Lāčplēsis is a real figure of Latvian folklore who's got a pedigree going back into Latvian traditional song. But he essentially creates an epic. Lāčplēsis is a warrior with the power to transform himself into a bear. But he writes this tremendous work of literature, and it becomes the national epic of Latvia. Now, that's absolutely fine, of course, but we have to bear in mind that this is a 19th century creation, and you've got similar things like the Kalevala in Finland. So you've got these national epics, these national mythologies that are being developed in a very free, very creative way, typical of the time, but not the way that we would do folklore today, not the way that we would choose to study folklore. So yeah, part of my work is to try and disentangle that rather creative stuff from what I'm interested in. I'm not actually interested in the 19th century. I'm interested in the pre-Christian period in the Baltic. The Baltic states, very, very late to convert to Christianity. Real Christianization does not take place until the very late 18th century. So I'm interested in any material that we can recover on Baltic folklore, Baltic mythology, before that period of the late 18th century.
I mean, it's very interesting also because when we talk about when you talk about like Baltic, you know, area, and are you talking specifically the Eastern, what we call now Eastern European Baltic states, or do you also include like Sweden and sort of Finland and so the Germanic traditions?
Yeah, this is the trouble with the word Baltic. It's got multiple meanings. Yeah, so it can, of course, refer to any nation that's bordering upon the Baltic Sea. So that would include Sweden and Finland and
Denmark,
and indeed Poland. But I'm using it in the rather more restricted sense of referring to the Balts as a people. So that is speakers of Baltic languages, the Lithuanians and the Latvians. The Estonians, because of their very close geographical proximity and their shared history. I mean, when you bear in mind that Latvia and Estonia, for most of modern history, have been one country, the Estonians are so intimately involved in that story that they're often included as well. Although from a folkloric point of view, from the point of view of mythology and culture, they are actually very, very different because, of course, the Estonians are a Finnic people. And therefore, the elements that you expect to find within Finnic culture, so the strong kind of influence of shamanism, for example, that's very much present in Estonian folklore, Estonian folk religion. Whereas, yeah, Latvian and Lithuanian folk religion have their own character, which is distinctively Baltic.
It's interesting because obviously, if there's a couple of things you said like that really deserve to be unpacked in terms of, you know, people adding their own interpretations and retellings of folklore, and like a lot of writers such as myself, you know, I write I wrote 4 books that were inspired by Slavic folklore and sort of pre-Christian, specifically Slavic folklore. And so me and like a lot of folklorists, like Tracy Fahey, like we sort of see it as like adding another layer, and we kind of, you know, I don't want to speak for her, but it's like, you know, it's a retelling tradition, right? Where you kind of add something new, and you take it and you play around with it. And it's, I feel like, because there's so many stories in Lithuania, and you know, when I read stories, it's very hard to tell, like, is the Polish story, is the Lithuanian story, is the Russian story sometimes, you know, like it's because you will see 3 or 4 versions that are very similar. Like, how distinct are those 2, maybe 3 states that you mentioned, are in comparison to, for example, Poland or Czech Republic or Russia?
I think when it comes to the interaction between the Polish and Lithuanian languages in Lithuania itself, so the former Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is of course a much larger area than Lithuania is today, and included the whole of what's now Belarus, and also bits of what's now Russia, and bits of what's now Ukraine. Within that area, you had an aristocracy who until the early 20th century, they largely spoke Polish. But that doesn't mean that they didn't think of themselves as Lithuanians. And they often are quite vociferous in saying that they are Lithuanians. And the analogy that I would draw is with the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. And these are all people in 19th century Ireland who are Protestants rather than Catholics, and therefore kind of alienated from the mass of the people who are Catholics, speak English rather than Irish, might indeed be of English descent, might even have been born in England, and yet in the late 19th century, there is this absolutely emphatic identification of many of these Anglo-Irish aristocrats as being Irish. And they become leaders, indeed, in a kind of national revival of Irishness. So I think what I would say is that Lithuanianness is a very complex thing. And the version of Lithuanianness that is presented today by official or semi-official channels within the Republic of Lithuania is not the only version of Lithuanianness that there is. And one of the versions of Lithuanianness is a kind of Polish Lithuanianness, or a Polish-speaking Lithuanianness, in which Polish is the medium of culture, but the material of culture is Lithuanian and goes way back to medieval Lithuanian tradition. And that's because there was a very, very long tradition of Lithuanian culture being mediated in Polish, at least at an elite level. So I think it's very hard to dismiss that. But you also have to bear in mind that, you know, Belarus is also part of this. And so a huge amount of Lithuanian culture is mediated in the Belarusian language. And so you've got this kind of multi-linguistic polity, and that's before we even get onto the Yiddish element and the huge cultural superpower, the Jewish cultural superpower of early 20th century Lithuania, you know, of Vilnius as a great Jewish city. Which sort of has to be considered separately, really. I wouldn't want to run that in with everything else because it's such a vast topic in itself. But yeah, I think it's just so complex. But both the Polish speakers and the Lithuanian speakers and the sorry. But the Polish speakers and the Lithuanian speakers and the Belarusian speakers, they're all interested in Lithuanian, what I would call Lithuanian folklore, Lithuanian mythology, but all doing it in their own slightly different ways.
Yes, I mean, when we're looking and like comparing, especially, and say you focus on pre-Christian traditions, that is also my area of interest, and the difficulties that come from trying to research it, because of course, you know, Norse mythology and Celtic mythology was transcribed by Christian monks, so that brings another layer of difficulty, because they, of course, would censor things that they did not think were interesting or necessary. So that's why we know so much less about female heroes and female goddesses that we know were there, but their stories were just not as transcribed as accurately, perhaps, or as fully. But when it comes to Eastern Europe, the process of Christianizing those regions was a bit more forceful, and it was yes, so those traditions were not written down. So can you tell us about how you do your research and who you talk to?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that, yeah, we have this huge evidential problem in that very little is written down about Baltic mythology before the 19th century. And I've already explained the kind of the problems about the 19th century records of this. I think the difficulty is that when we get records of pre-Christian belief and practice, they're generally recorded by either missionaries or ethnographers. Now, the missionaries are interested in kind of recording the dreadful things that people believe and do because they're heathens who need to be converted. So obviously there we have to be cautious that they might be exaggerating how awful these, beliefs or practices are, or misrepresenting them for their own purposes. And with the ethnographers, I think it's more interesting with the ethnographers because they seem to be genuinely driven by curiosity. And sometimes the two are combined. So sometimes you will get in the 17th century missionaries who are also genuinely interested in recording ethnographic data. So you've got Matthias Pretorius, you've got Paul Einhorn. Matthias Pretorius records Prussian and Lithuanian folklore, and you've got Einhorn recording Latvian folklore. I haven't mentioned the Prussians because the Prussians are an extinct people, but they were also, this is the old Prussians, they were also a Baltic people. And one of the ironies is that although they're extinct, we actually know a bit more about the Prussians than almost anybody else in the pre-Christian period, partly because they were the first Baltic people that the Teutonic Knights attempted to Christianize, although albeit with limited success. And therefore there's kind of more written about them because there was a longer period of contact with literate Christians. All of these people, of course, are I don't want to say illiterate because that seems the wrong word, but they're sort of illiterate, non-literate. There is no place for writing within the pagan societies. It doesn't have any purpose because they're oral cultures. So nothing is written down by themselves, and therefore we're always reliant on other people. But yeah, the trouble with the ethnographers is that they don't seem to be that interested in myths. They don't seem to want to write down the myths because they're not storytellers. And your podcast is about storytelling, and storytelling is a very particular way of presenting information, which is rather different to the kind of the cataloging mindset of the ethnographer, or even potentially the folklorist. I mean, some folklorists are also storytellers, but I think folklorists are not necessarily storytellers.
I mean, I look at storytelling in a broader definition as well, in terms of the way we collate data and the way we curate data. That is a form of storytelling as well. What you choose to describe, what you choose to omit, that is also, you are creating something new. You are creating a collection of something that forms an image that other people will interpret in, even if you don't do it consciously. This creates a narrative that might be very different from the original materials when you look at it overall.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, when it comes to what myths we actually have recorded before the 19th century for the Baltic peoples, you can pretty much count them on the fingers of one hand because there's so little interest shown in this thing. Some of them are of a historical nature. So perhaps the most famous would be the myth of Gediminas. So Gediminas is the founder of the city of Vilnius. And there's a story about how he is hunting and goes to sleep And while he's asleep, he has a dream where he hears a wolf howling. And in his dream, he wakes up and he sees that, in fact, it's a wolf made of iron, a giant iron wolf that's standing on a nearby hill. And it's not only howling, but in its belly, 100 iron wolves, baby iron wolves, also howling. And he's really troubled by this dream, and he doesn't know what to think of it. So he goes down into the valley, and he finds himself at a Świętaragis, which is a kind of sacred spot for the cremation of bodies, and finds a priest there called Lizdeka, a pagan priest, obviously. This is during the pagan era. And Lizdeka says, well, this is this wolf that you saw is in fact a city which you are to build on this spot, and its voice will be so powerful it will go out into the whole world like the howling of 100 iron wolves.
Rome
so
2.0.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Yeah, and the wolf motif is very significant, and you get this mythology about the Lithuanians being Romans. But I think the difference with that stuff about the Lithuanians being Romans, I don't think anybody seriously believes that your ordinary Lithuanian living in the forest is going to be saying that. That's clearly a literary elaboration. But the Iron Wolf myth could very well be, in fact, probably is, genuine folklore in the sense that it's a spontaneous creation of the people. And it's first recorded in the 15th century, then it's transmitted in various different forms. So that's an early example. So that you've got the historical myths, and then you've got a couple of things which are sort of noted down by chroniclers and ethnographers. So, for example, Maciej Stryjkowski, who's a Polish-speaking chronicler, whether you would describe him as Polish or Lithuanian, both, either. He writes a chronicle of Lithuania in Polish. He records this curious myth about how Lithuanians believe that when they die, they will find themselves confronted with having to climb a tall mountain. And in order to do so, they won't be able to use their hands because it's too tall. So they will need the claws of bears and lynxes to climb up that mountain. And when they get to the top, then they will be judged by Dievas. Dievas, of course, being the Baltic supreme god, not the Christian god, although the two eventually become fused. Now, this is a really interesting one to me because this is actually confirmed, or maybe confirmed, by archaeology. And we know that these talismans, which contain the claws of bears and lynxes, were placed on the funeral pyres, or later, after cremation is banned under Christianization, in the graves of Lithuanians. So we have very good reason to believe that this is true. They really did believe this. So that's a genuine myth. And then another one that we have, this is recorded in the 15th century by a missionary, a guy called John Jerome of Prague. And it's a very early missionary account of somebody going into Lithuania just after the official, in fact, Samagitia, which is the western region of Lithuania, was a slightly culturally separate region, which is converted even later than the rest of Lithuania. And he goes there in about 1420, so literally less than 10 years after it's been formally converted to Christianity. And he finds the people there, they tell a story about how the sun was imprisoned by the moon, and then the thunder god with a hammer had to come and rescue the sun from being imprisoned by the moon. So yeah, there aren't many more than that. I mean,
Thunder god with a hammer. That sounds like a Norse influence.
Yeah, well,
do you get many of those when you're sort of?
There's a god, a kind of heavenly smith god, Teliavelis, in Baltic folklore. Because then we come to the other source, which is the richest source, but also kind of a problematic source, and that is the Latvian Dainas. Now, these are an amazing collection of songs, traditional songs, which are recorded in the 19th century among the Latvian peasantry. There are also their Lithuanian equivalents, but the Lithuanian equivalents seem to have become much more Christianized than the Latvian ones. The Latvian ones seem to have much more kind of pagan mythological elements. So they're recorded kind of in the mid-19th century, they're one of the great national treasures of Latvia. They're kept in this special cabinet in the National Library in Riga, and they're almost like they're the crown jewels of the Latvian nation. They are as precious because they are the only record that the Latvians had even less of their mythological and folkloric and pre-Christian religion recorded than the Lithuanians. So this is all that there is. But they're remarkable. I mean, they tell stories about the Baltic gods. I tend to use the Lithuanian names for the Baltic gods, just because I've studied Lithuanian and not Latvian. So apologies to any Latvians listening. But they tell stories about Dievas and Perkunas. Dievas being the supreme god, Perkunas being the god of thunder. The Dievu Sunelie, the sons of Dievas, who are these kind of heavenly horsemen, so a bit like Castor and Pollux in Roman mythology. Talks about Saule, the sun, who is a goddess. The sun is always feminine in Baltic mythology. Oshra, the goddess of the dawn, and Menulis, who is the moon. And Saule and Menulis have a sort of fraught relationship, as you might expect in a sort of in a cosmological sense. So yeah, I mean, these are absolutely fascinating. But the burning question is, to what extent do these reflect pre-Christian?
That's the
think,
real difficulty, isn't it?
Yeah.
And do you corrupt, like, I find that there's obviously people look for to corroborate their evidence. They look to comparatives like linguistics and archaeology and ethnographics, but like a lot of books that I have on Slavic folklore, they tell completely opposing stories. So same figures, right? But there's just there's like one god who is a god of the afterlife and the god of poetry or whatever, and in the other book he's the god of cattle.
Yeah.
And it's very hard when it comes to those kind of figures. And I think in some ways it might be easier so instead of trying to kind of reconstruct the whole religion kind of aspect, the everyday folklore is a little easier, isn't it? In terms of like the little stories that people believe in this region, and they kind of tell each other and tell their children.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that the difficulty with pantheons of cultures which don't actually have a written tradition, where it was either written down by themselves, in the case of the Greeks and Romans, or where it was written down in a fairly consistent way by Christians who nevertheless had a sort of pretty clear idea about what they thought these gods were, like the Eddas. The Norse Eddas are fairly consistent about which god is which and so forth. But yeah, you're absolutely right about the total inconsistency. And I think the waters are muddied by the fact that you've got people quite early on who are struggling to do this, writing lists of gods and saying who they think those gods are. There's a guy called Simon Grunau in the early 16th century who makes these largely nonsensical lists of Prussian gods. Partly you've got the problem in interpretatio romana, which is where people, their whole education is suffused with Greek and Roman deities, and therefore they see the whole world of paganism through that prism, and they think, oh, it's like the Greeks and Romans. It must be, it must be like that. And it's not, and I think part of the problem is we are not looking at a single Baltic religion. We are looking at Baltic religions. So in the same way that if you look at Australia had, I believe it was sort of over 1,000 Aboriginal languages before European colonizers turned up. The variety is kind of beyond comprehension almost. And I think the same is true of pre-Christian religion in Europe before Christianization. The variety was vast. And we've kind of lost touch with that because we see religion, I think, as under Christian influence, we see religion as a rather monolithic thing. We think of it as something which you buy into with a particular confession, with a particular kind of statement of faith, and say, yes, I believe that. pre-Christian religion doesn't work like that. You know,
but even with the with Christianity, and I mean that's even before you get to sort of Protestants and Puritans and all of that. Like even when you're just speaking of kind of Catholic religion, there's so many regional differences that people are often unaware of, because you know, if they practice Catholicism in one country their whole life, and they will be completely unaware of more folkloric sort of traditions in their country. And like in Poland, for sure, there are so many holidays, which are like church holidays, which actually come from pre-Christian traditions, like there's a holiday of the day of Virgin Mary the herbalist,
okay. Yeah.
which is, you know, it's quite distinctly different, isn't it? And but the point of, there was a point to this, and it was to do with, you know, the it's what now it was to do with the worship of Mokosh, you know, and the goddess of sort of women and medicine, and that's the day where women would traditionally gather herbs to dry and to preserve. So but you know, but that holiday is not necessarily, you know, something that it translates internationally, isn't it? So I think even now we have those many differences that we're completely unaware of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that the way in which some of these traditions survive Christianization is another fascinating issue. I mean, yeah, there are a number of great festivals in the Baltic nations. So you've got Jurginis, which is the feast of St. George on the 23rd of April, which seems to be much more than just a celebration of St. George. And indeed, it's quite possible that because St. George is a very popular saint, he was very popular in the Middle Ages, it seems that he was being worshipped as a pagan god by the Lithuanians and the Latvians and the Estonians before they actually became Christians. And so you get this kind of weird sort of liminal zone, like a twilight zone between paganism and Christianity, where the pagans are adopting Christian saints, perhaps also John the Baptist, because you've got Ioannis, which is,
or you put a Christian saint's name over the name of a god, or
yeah. But I think that what sometimes gets said is that the church did that. I'm not convinced. I think maybe the pagans did that themselves, that they are interested in these sort of sources of sacred power. And if St. George is said to be a powerful saint, why don't we worship him as a god? If St. John is said to be a powerful saint, why don't we worship him as a god? If the Virgin Mary is said to be powerful, let's worship her as a god. And one fascinating thing which I'm looking into at the moment in Lithuania and Latvia is glacial erratics, these massive stones that are found in the forests around this whole area. Because there isn't natural stone very much occurring, you know, there isn't sort of, you know, there aren't mountains in these countries. These are very important sites that become infused with sacred significance in the pre-Christian era. And then you get this attempted Christianization of them by the people themselves in order to preserve the veneration of those rocks. Now, in some cases, it's successful. So somebody says, I saw the Virgin Mary appear on this rock. Look at these two weird impressions on the rock. They are the marks of the feet where the Virgin Mary stood. This happens numerous times.
I mean, it's a great way to preserve something. If someone wants to destroy something, it's like, no, but I saw your God.
Absolutely. And there's one occasion where it was massively successful, and that was at Šiluva. So Our Lady of Šiluva, the greatest Marian cult in Lithuania, is associated with a sacred rock, to the point that when you go to Šiluva, at the shrine of the apparition, the Church of the Apparition, which is where the Virgin Mary appeared in 1608, next to the altar, coming up from the ground through the floor of the church, is the sacred rock on which the Virgin Mary stood. Now, you know, that's an expression of popular Catholicism, which is deeply rooted in pre-Christian religion, because there's endless missionary reports of people worshipping these rocks. And so I think that this is an example of, it's not an example, I don't think, of the church imposing things on them. I think it's actually the agency of the people themselves. They have realized that, you know, the war against Christianization is not going to be won. So at least they're going to accept it on their own terms. So,
That's
you
really
know,
interesting. I've never heard this interpretation. I mean, it does make sense, obviously, like, you know, people do adapt and they do sort of change their stories in many ways. Like, there's certain things that I know in Poland, the church tried to eradicate quite consciously. So, for example, the goddess Morana or Marzanna, who was the goddess of death, and now it's thought that she was the goddess of death and rebirth and blood and womanhood and all the good stuff. And there is a tradition in Poland still where in a sort of first sight of spring, we take straw doll that represents Marzanna and we drown her in flowing water, right? And that is a tradition that, and we still call it the drowning of Marzanna, right? So that the earth can be reborn. And that is a tradition that the church tried to eradicate for centuries before they gave up. And one of the ways they tried to eradicate it is they tried to supplant their own made-up folk tradition, which was the throwing of Judas off a tower.
yeah.
So they tried to make it into a thing where they made like the straw, it's still the same straw doll, but now it's Judas and we throw him off a off a wall somewhere. And for some reason it was just not as powerful. It was just not as good storytelling. And so it just did not take. But
absolutely. I mean, it's true in Lithuania as well that there's mixed success at this, and I've encountered that there are some examples where the Jesuits, it's usually the Jesuits, they're having none of this, and they actually say, no, we're gonna actually get this rock and remove it and push it into a bog and stop you venerating it. But sometimes it does work. What doesn't work, I think, is the preservation of trees, perhaps because it's much easier to cut down a tree than it is to remove a rock. And so when it comes to rocks, if they're massive, you've kind of got to compromise on something. But with the trees, the worship of trees in Lithuania and Latvia, it endures into it's still going on when the records kind of run out in the late 18th century. And the reason they run out is the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Russians take over. The Jesuits are no longer able to go out into the countryside and minister. But at the same time, I think that moment in 1795, when you get the partition, that's a kind of religious watershed for Lithuania and also for sort of Eastern Latvia, which at that point...
Sorry, just because I think it's getting into so much details, just to quickly explain. So Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was quite weak politically in the 18th century, and so the surrounding kind of superpowers like, you know, the Austrian Empire and Prussia and Russia have basically decided to carve up the Commonwealth between themselves, and Poland's disappeared off the map, world map, for 100 years. So that's what what we're talking about. Sorry, just because it was quite
no, absolutely, it needs
deep
explaining.
dive.
That's what I'm referring to. And so these areas come under Russian rule, and that of course means that the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, is in the ascendant. Up to that point, for centuries, the Roman Catholic Church had been trying to convert the Lithuanians to Catholicism. And in that period after 1795, in sort of the early years of the 19th century, it seems that a great sea change takes place. And I think it's to do with the relationship between religion and national identity. And because the Catholic identity of Lithuania is suddenly threatened, people start to identify with Catholicism in a way that they hadn't up to that point. So your Lithuanian peasant before 1795 is like, why should I cut down my sacred tree? I don't care what the church says. After 1795, they might actually think, if I see a Roman Catholic priest, he's a hero because he's somebody who's standing up to the Russians, who I hate even more. It was seen
in a kind of nationalistic sense. I wanted to sort of bring it back a little bit to the pre-Christian folk traditions. and gathering information from pre-Christian folk traditions in the context of Christianization. Because the one thing obviously I am not a scholar. I use my research in my work, but this is a very different approach. It's a much looser approach. But for me, definitely there was the element of values and the sort of value system in the mythology, and there were certain commonalities I found in the pre-Christian stories. So for me, the pre-Christian Slavic stories focused a lot on empathy. There was a sense of like the hero could conquer the monster by empathizing with the monster, like in some Striga versions of the Striga story. There was a huge affinity to the natural world and a sense of respect for animals. Animals could talk, could communicate often, and for pre-Christian Slavs, horses, for example, had souls. They were considered to have souls just as humans did.
Yes.
And so there were all those different values that then, if the moment you get the Christian influence over the stories, that changed entirely. And so for me, I felt like it was quite easy to kind of pick out the more pre-Christian stories based on their value systems that they espoused. I mean, is that something that you use at all in your research?
Yes, I think that's very true. I think that there is I suppose you could almost call it a pagan mentality, a pagan worldview, which is distinct from the Christian one. And one of the things that I would draw attention to is fatalism versus providentialism. So what the church was trying to encourage people to believe was a kind of a providentialist view where you trust in God, and ultimately you commit things to God's justice, and everything will be sorted out eventually. But the fatalist view is a much more, I suppose, it's a view of human destiny, which is determined by, I mean, in many of the stories, is determined by kind of a goddess of fate, who is Lima, who is the goddess who sort of spins the fates. And there's no kind of undoing that. So there isn't a merciful God who can sort of suddenly jump in and change things. Things are more fixed. And justice is more absolute, because it's kind of untempered by mercy. But at the same time, there are great rewards for those who give service to the gods. And so, one example of that would be the Laumes. So the Laumes are, I don't want to call them fairies, because that would perhaps be to impose a cultural
imposing your
that
English worldview.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. But the Laumes are forest spirits that appear in the form of women with enormous breasts, and they are very, very beautiful and have long hair, and they are mostly benevolent unless you violate certain taboos. And this is another feature that it could be described as a sort of aspect of pagan mentality, is the existence of apparently irrational to us taboos, these things which you must not do. And one of them is that you must not spin or weave on a Thursday. And if you do, the Laumes will be very, very dissatisfied, because they take over that work on Thursday. So if a woman has spinning to do, then if she goes to the side of a lake or a river and offers it to the Laumes will do it in double quick time. But there was one woman who became greedy, and so she asked the Laumes, can you, I'm just going to leave you loads of this stuff, you can do the spinning for me. And so they decided to do the spinning with her intestines. So there is this kind of, if you overstep the mark with these deities, even though they're benevolent in some respects, they're also quite capricious, and they follow these kind of rigid taboos.
I mean, it feels very similar to Christianity to me. On the seventh day, you have to rest. And that was enforced quite strongly.
Indeed, yes. So you get these taboos about refraining from work on certain days. That seems to be something which is common between Christianity and these pre-Christian traditions. But yeah, I mean, it's I suppose, yeah, the other aspect of this, which I think is very prominent within Lithuanian culture, for example, is the sort of fatalism about good fortune. So if somebody has good fortune in your village, it means that they've taken it from someone else, because there's only ever the same amount of good fortune to go around. And therefore, someone else's good fortune is someone else's misfortune. And there are all sorts of traditions associated with how you acquire good fortune
In
and the
Poland,
role
there
of,
was Nędza, a creature that you could sort of, that once or bieda, and once it entered your house, it would cause, you know, poverty and all kinds of misfortune. And the only way to get rid of it was to pass it on to someone else.
yeah, in Lithuania, it's the opposite. So you have Aitvaras, who is a being who, it's a sort of like a cockatrice. Cockatrice would probably be the closest equivalent in British folklore. And it's a, yeah, so a sort of monstrous bird kind of chicken creature, which is like a black cockerel with flaming feathers. It brings good fortune, but also it makes your life a living hell. And if you try and pass it on, then your house will burn down. And it's sort of really quite dark sort of idea that even good fortune is ultimately accompanied by a kind of curse. And the idea that everything has to be passed on. You can't, you know, there's no kind of providential intervention. If you want to get rid of some ill fortune, you've got to find a way to pass it on to somebody else and things like that. So I think all these things, yeah, they are kind of, they belong to a pre-Christian worldview. Yeah.
So I was thinking about the kind of influences from outside of that immediate Eastern European area. And I found because I'm just generally interested in folklore and world folklore, and I've noticed that there's certain similarities, you know, like Polish comes from Indo-European family of languages. And I feel like there's certain similarities between certain Hindu gods, for example, and certain gods that we know about in Slavic history. There's some words even that are quite similar to Sanskrit words. I find like pięć means 5 in Polish, you know, it's piać in Sanskrit, things like that, or ogień, fire, and ogni, you know. So do you compare, like, do you go, when you're researching this folklore, do you go beyond the borders?
Yeah, this is comparative mythology, and probably the most prominent figure in this would be Maria Gimbutas, who was an amazing ethnologist and archaeologist who was largely responsible for the Kurgan hypothesis, which is the idea that these Kurgan burial mounds that you find in Central Asia might have been associated with the original bearers of the Indo-European language. And so, yeah, her speculations led her then into seeing whether she could reconstruct some kind of original Indo-European religion, which she concluded was, well, in fact, she thought the pre-Indo-European people were matriarchal, but then the Indo-Europeans brought a patriarchal system of a pantheon of gods and so forth. I mean, I think because I was trained as a historian, I struggle with comparative mythology as a methodology because it seems to me quite tenuous. That doesn't mean it's not true, and it doesn't have value. And I think it has great cultural value. I mean, when you look
I
at,
think in lack of concrete evidence and written evidence of you know, sort of grasping at straws, sort of scientifically
yeah,
speaking, is all we're left with.
yeah. I mean, I think there are some things that are more convincing than others. I mean, when you look at the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of all Hindu poems, which talks about a horse sacrifice. I mean, there are so many parallels there with the sacrality of the horse that we find elsewhere in Indo-European cultures. And the idea that the horse is absolutely central to Indo-European culture seems kind of pretty obvious, given that these are people who emigrated over vast distances across land And we know from the archaeology that they developed chariots and so forth. So that to me is sort of one of the more plausible things. But I think if you take it much further than that, once you start trying to identify specific gods, I'm a bit skeptical about that, because I think over such long periods of time, these beings can undergo such profound evolutions and changes
Change,
that
but can you say if it's the same thing even?
yeah, indeed. So even if a name has some kind of link etymologically, it doesn't mean that it's the same thing, because a deity is not the same as an animal. It doesn't have an unchanging nature. So yeah, I think it's difficult. I mean, for me as a historian, it's just not what I do, because it's not what I'm trained to do. So I tend to stay away from the comparative mythology. But I think I also am a bit wary of it, because it underplays the particularity of cultural traditions. And by particularity, I don't mean anything like, kind of ethno-nationalism or anything like that. But I do think that we need to kind of give credit to what people were believing in this place at a specific time, rather than imposing on them concepts that are taken from somewhere thousands of miles away. I just don't think that's fair on people who, have for so long been without a voice, because they never had a chance to pass on their mythologies or their religion. To then sort of impose on. I think that it's almost like, I call it interpretatio Indo-Europeana. So by analogy with interpretatio Romana. So in the same way that you got these people in the 16th and 17th century saying, oh, it's like Jupiter, it's like Mars, it's like Aphrodite. You then get people in the 20th century saying, oh, it's like Indian religion. Oh,
yes, because that we have very well
Persian religion.
documented, isn't it? And it's just trying to extrapolate information from that.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of the same thing. It's this kind of cultural imposition, this overlaying of cultures, which I just think we need to think of things on their own terms.
Yeah.
And that means that we're more attentive to their distinctiveness.
I think it's interesting also when you compare, like when you look at how people view themselves, right? And where they think they come from. So for a long time, Polish people, and by Polish people, I also mean, that's sort of pre-partition. By Polish people, I mean Polish aristocrats, because they considered themselves a completely different nation entirely to the peasants, who were not seen as Polish, even though they spoke the same language. They were not seen as
not Sarmatians.
Yes, they were not Sarmatians. Yes, which is essentially Sarmatia is like, it's the Scythians. So Polish nobles, and there were many of them. They thought they were descendants of the Scythians, which is really interesting. And they definitely did share certain things, like their absolute reverence for horses, right? So Polish people were great horsemen, and so they thought that comes from those traditions. And there's no historical evidence, as far as I'm aware, but that is truly the case. But that was such a deeply ingrained myth.
Yeah, now I think the Sarmatianism craze is really fascinating, and you got these Polish nobles shaving off their hair and growing enormous moustaches and wearing these kind of bizarre costumes that sort of invented themselves as how they imagined.
Well, the costumes were very much influenced by the proximity to the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, absolutely. Very sort of ironically, because the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was usually at war with the Ottoman Empire, they were sort of dressing in this slightly sort of Ottoman style. And
I mean, because it's beautiful. I mean, it's just the lushness of it. It's and it did sort of set them apart to the common man as well.
So. But also set them apart from the aristocracy of the rest of Europe. But I think one reason for it is that because the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was such a diverse realm, but the aristocracy mostly all spoke Polish, they needed some kind of unifying identity. And if they sort of emphasized their Polishness, that would sort of offend the Lithuanians and the Belarusians. and if they emphasized, something else, that would offend someone else. And so if they kind of invented this identity, which is I mean, the Sarmatians, Herodotus talks about them, so they were a real people, but they were probably sort of a northern group of Iranians who kind of were, as you say, in the sort of Scythia kind of area. But they sort of drew this people out of Herodotus and said, oh yeah, we're them, let's just, Sarmatians. And it gives this kind of common identity to the whole aristocracy of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this vast realm, which has no kind of internal coherence. I mean, it's so vast that, and so culturally and linguistically diverse, that they needed something to keep it all together.
Exactly. I mean, we are kind of running out of time. But before we go, I just wanted to get your opinion on what I see as a sort of resurgence of interest in pre-Christian Slavic traditions in Poland for certain. I'm not sure if it's the same in Lithuania. But have you noticed that? Because I've definitely noticed it. It's like a trend on this, obviously on social media. There's more books being published, which is something that was just not there in my childhood.
Is this rozdomieństwo? Is that the correct term? The Polish version of Slav.
It's the prasłowianie, słowiańskość, you could say, like the Slavic spirit, and people are digging up like old traditions. There's festivals, all of that.
No, in Lithuania there is a tradition, Romova, which goes back really to the late 1960s. In Latvia, it goes back much further, so it goes back to the 1920s. So the pagan revival in Latvia begins quite early on. Likewise in Estonia. In Lithuania, it's something which is quite a minority interest, and I think is controversial with some people, because Lithuania remains quite a profoundly Catholic country. In Latvia, by contrast, Latvia doesn't really have a definitively dominant strain of Christianity, because it's divided between, there are some Lutherans, there are some Catholics, there are some Russian Orthodox. And so I think that the kind of revived native faith movement there, Dievturi, has been able to make more progress. So, for example, they have a permanent temple on an island.
Oh, so it's like an actual like neo-paganism kind of thing.
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
I mean, I was talking about like just like folk traditions and like aesthetic folk traditions, and like the.
Yeah, this is the thing. I mean, I think going back to Romuva in Lithuania, the number of people who would actually be adherents of Romuva is pretty tiny, but the cultural impact that it makes. I mean, for example, there's a folk music group called Grinda, which is associated with the Romuva movement, and that's hugely popular. Well beyond people who would have any kind of interest in neo-paganism. And I think, this sort of idea that at major celebrations you kind of dress as medieval Lithuanians, and you sort of perform versions of rituals. This is not seen as a religious thing; it's just seen as a cultural thing. And there is most definitely amongst Lithuanians an identification with the pagan ancestors, and great pride amongst Lithuanians in saying that we were the last nation in Europe to be converted to Christianity. Because if you're not that favorable to Catholicism, that's something to be proud of. But if you are favorable to Catholicism, that's also something to be proud of, because it gives you a special status as the youngest daughter of the church, as Lithuania was known. And therefore it means your Catholicism is more alive than anybody else, because you were the last in Europe to adopt it. So you can interpret it whichever way you want to.
Whichever way you're leaning personally, that's how it is.
Exactly. But it's interesting that, the major edition of all the sources about Lithuanian paganism was published by the Catholic Church. So clearly, there is kind of interest in this from all quarters. But yeah, it's fascinating. I think it's kind of on a spectrum, really.
I think it's like that fine balance between, for sure, the Roman Catholic Church in Poland is very nationalistic. Extremely so. It did serve a function in kind of sort of struggle under kind of the Soviet sort of rule over Poland. So it had this kind of freedom struggle label attached to it, and it sort of preserves this as this kind of nationalistic sort of bedrock of Polish identity. And I think it definitely might lean into certain things to do with Slavic identity as well for that purpose.
Yeah, and I think that that's an interesting question is kind of what comes next culturally in Central and Eastern Europe once a generation that never knew communism comes to power and comes to cultural kind of dominance.
I mean, we are already getting that. I was 4 years old when the communism sort of ended in Poland, right? So I know it all from stories, but I never lived it. So, and I am not that young anymore.
Yeah.
So you know, that's where it is. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for watching the video. Every week there's something different. So click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you and see you next week.